is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories: division in Europe over whether Ukraine meets the conditions to join the EU, as talks on a new military aid package get underway in Brussels. Our other headlines: Russia's president vows to fight on in Ukraine. He admits that 300,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or injured. What chance of brokering peace in the Middle East? The United States National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan meets Israel's Prime Minister to discuss Gaza. And why the latest frontline in America's culture wars is the right to abortion. It's a decisive moment for Ukraine. Leaders of the European Union are meeting in Brussels, hoping to approve the start of accession talks for Kyiv and release further financial support. But Hungary has vowed to block both moves. The Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, speaking ahead of the talks, said there is no reason to negotiate Ukraine's bid to join the EU, as it fails to meet the criteria. Most leaders also want to give the green light to a new $54 billion aid package for Kyiv. The Ukrainian President Zelensky appealed to the 27 countries, saying, "Do not betray the Ukrainian people and their faith in Europe." Well, let's talk to our correspondent Giles Gibson in Brussels. Giles, what more have Orban and Zelensky been saying?
Well, Jamie, as Viktor Orban arrived on that red carpet behind me, we saw him explaining some of his reasons why he says he's against that $54 billion aid package that's been proposed for Ukraine. He said that if we want to give longer-term aid to Ukraine, as he described it, then it must be outside of the EU's budget, so outside the EU's main budget. As for Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, and that video call to these leaders gathered here in Brussels, we saw him really trying to sort of amp up the pressure in terms of the sense of an occasion here. So he said this will be a day that will go down in history, and he urged these European leaders gathered here in Brussels not to fall back into what he described as indecision. Of course, we saw Volodymyr Zelensky earlier this week in the US Capitol, meeting with the US President Joe Biden, as well as congressional leaders, doing his best in person to try to unlock an aid package from the Americans that's being held up by the Republican Party in the US Congress right now. There were some theories that we could see Zelensky popping up here in Brussels as well, to try and also urge these leaders in person to unlock to approve this latest aid package. But there are reports that he was advised by some of the top leaders in the European Council not to actually come to Brussels and to address them by video call instead.
What's the EU's official position on Ukraine's membership bid?
So Ukraine has been given official candidate status, and it's actually held that for quite some time. It's had that since June of 2022. The European Commission itself has recommended that negotiations about accession begin with Kyiv, and that, of course, is when European officials and Ukrainian officials would get around tables over weeks or months or even years and get into the nitty-gritty of how to actually become a member of the EU. So, you know, things like aligning the statute book, the laws of Ukraine with European law itself. But actually, for those negotiations to officially begin, that recommendation from the European Commission is not enough. We need to see the leaders around the table just behind me, the European Council, actually giving the green light for those negotiations to begin. And of course, because decision-making within the European Council is always unanimous, Viktor Orban, just one leader, can hold up that process from starting if he wants to.
Giles, thank you for that. Our correspondent Giles Gibson in Brussels. Well, meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has reiterated his reasons for Ukraine's membership bid to join the EU. Let's talk to our correspondent, Megumi Lim in Kyiv. Megumi, Kyiv and Moscow have been exchanging drone attacks. What more do we know about this?
Well, that's right. Overnight, Ukraine said Russia launched 42 Shahed drones against Ukraine, targeting mostly the southern port city of Odessa. And the Ukrainian Air Force said that it successfully shot down 41 out of the 42, but the strike left at least 11 people injured, including 3 children who had to be hospitalized. But also, the Russian Defense Ministry said that they had to shoot down Ukrainian drones flying over the Moscow and Kaluga regions overnight as well. And so this year we have been seeing, as you said, exchanges of drone attacks from both sides. And this is after officials in Ukraine said that this year they will not only be defending their country, but they'll be responding to attacks by Moscow. So we have been seeing more and more of these attacks happening within the borders of Russia. But it also appears that Russia has been ramping up more aerial attacks against Ukraine, as the temperatures have indeed dropped here. We saw Russia launch 10 ballistic missiles at Ukraine, targeting the capital Kyiv on Wednesday night. And although the Air Force said it managed to shoot down all of them, it also left at least more than 50 people injured. So we are likely to be seeing more of these exchanges in the days and weeks to come.
Megumi, thank you for that. Our correspondent Megumi Lim in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has repeated that Russia's goals in Ukraine remain unchanged and that peace can only be achieved after Moscow's objectives in the country have been met. At his first end-of-year news conference since this invasion began, President Putin said what he called the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine would continue. However, he also indicated that more than 300,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or injured, far more than the official Kremlin figures. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. Dasha, what has Putin been saying about the state of play in the military action?
Well, as we have heard the Russian President Vladimir Putin speaking in the press conference, he was very certain that Russia will achieve the goals that have been set for Moscow in the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. President Putin also said that there are 617,000 Russian soldiers along the contact line with Ukraine, that is 2,000 kilometers long. The Russian president was also addressing the issues that are of concern for many Russians, whether there could be potentially another wave of mobilization. With regard to that, Putin said very clearly that Russia does not need yet another wave of mobilization because there are many volunteers who are signing up to join the Russian army and to fight in Ukraine. He said that up to this moment, 486,000 men have been drafted voluntarily as soldiers to the Russian army, on top of 300,000 men who have been drafted in the previous wave of partial mobilization in Russia. But at the same time, President Putin also indicated that there have been a steady progress when it comes to the Russian fighting in the area of the special military operation, suggesting that the Russian troops have been making significant progress steadily along the entire contact line. And President Putin said that there could be peace in Ukraine, but obviously on the Russian terms. Let's listen in.
There will be peace when we achieve our goals that you mentioned. Now let's get back to these goals. They don't change. Let me remind you what we talked about then: the denazification of Ukraine, demilitarization, its neutral status. By the way, during the negotiations in Istanbul, we agreed on those, but these agreements were thrown away.
Dasha, Putin's been taking questions from the public. What can we make of what they've been asking and what they've been saying?
Well, obviously, in the 4-hour long marathon that the Russian president had during this press conference, he was asked the myriad of questions that are related to different spheres of the public life in Russia. Many of those questions are related to the concerns that Russians do have at the moment. These are the growing prices. People were asking how long those prices could be growing when it comes to the eggs, for instance, or to the chicken meat. And the Russian president was admitting that there have been certain mistakes made by the Russian government when it comes to the pricing. But at the same time, he was also reassuring the public that the economic situation is quite stable in Russia, with GDP expected to grow by 3.5% by the end of the year, and inflation rate being around 8%. So the Russian president was outlining the situation as it is at the moment. But keep in mind that this press conference is taking place as President Putin has announced that he would seek his 5th term in office as the Russian president. So many analysts are saying that the president's press conference was also part of his presidential campaign. We also have heard the Russian president talking about the relations with the Western countries, suggesting that Moscow was open to restart the normalization process, but it was the Western countries that were unwilling to do so. And speaking of the relations with the partners, for instance, with China, Putin was saying that the relationship between Moscow and Beijing is not targeting any other countries, but instead it is the guarantor of the global stability. And the Russian president was suggesting that Russia is open to have good relations with all the countries that are willing to have partnership on equal terms.
Dasha, thank you for that. Our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. Japan's Prime Minister has replaced 4 cabinet ministers in the middle of a corruption scandal. Fumio Kishida is trying to manage the fallout from claims that his party funneled millions of dollars into slush funds. Tokyo prosecutors are investigating allegations that LDP politicians failed to report $3.4 million in political funding over a period of 5 years. The UK has signed a deal with Japan and Italy to build the next generation of fighter jets in Britain. Development of the Tempest supersonic planes should begin in 2025, with the objective to have them operational by 2035 as a successor to the Royal Air Force Typhoon. The British Defence Secretary Grant Shapps flew to Tokyo on Thursday to sign the deal with his Japanese and Italian counterparts. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, United States National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan meets Israel's Prime Minister as divisions widen between Washington and Tel Aviv over Gaza.
Welcome to This Way Forward.
I'm Emma Keeling.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. Division in Europe over whether Ukraine fails to meet the conditions to join the EU as talks on a new military aid package get underway in Brussels. Our other headlines, Russia's president vows to fight on in Ukraine. He admits, though, that 300,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or injured. The United States National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is meeting Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Sullivan is touring the Middle East and has met Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince to talk about trying to create sustainable peace between Israel and Palestine. Divisions have appeared between Israel and its closest ally, the US, with President Biden warning that Israel risks losing global support over indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Gaza. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Sarah Coates, who's watching events in Tel Aviv. Sarah, what can we expect, if anything, from these talks?
Hello there, Jamie. Well, look, he will be wanting to take away a few achievements from this trip. One of those will be to getting more aid into the Gaza Strip via the Kerem Shalom crossing. We are hearing now that Israel may be opening that key crossing, which used to take in 60% of those trucks before this blockade was imposed on the Strip. He'll also be pushing Israel to once again limit these humanitarian casualties on the ground, civilian casualties on the ground. Also pushing Israel that it's losing this international support due to what the US is calling this indiscriminate bombing campaign. And look, this is something that is hurting President Biden at home also. Now, another issue of contention here, Jamie, will be potentially a time frame that Sullivan is expected to give the Israelis, that it needs to wrap this war up within a certain time frame there. That is expected to potentially be the end of January. But look, this is something that the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu certainly isn't happy about. He's been saying that Israel will take as long as it wants, with or without international support. Now, there's another issue here that is driving division between these two countries, and that is, of course, what Gaza should look like post-war. It seems that the Israelis don't really have some sort of a vision on what could happen here. Well, it's certainly not a vision anyway that's aligned with what the United States is saying, and that is for a two-state solution run by the Palestinian Authority. We have heard from Netanyahu over these last few days saying that that simply will not happen. So it will be very interesting a little later on today when we start hearing what's coming out of these meetings.
And despite the international calls to reduce civilian casualties, Israel is continuing its bombardment with dozens of people killed in Rafah.
You're certainly right. And look, this is an area that Israel declared a safe zone. It did put out an announcement a little earlier today saying there would be a 4-hour window where nothing would happen down there, no airstrikes. But look, we are hearing that people are still being pulled from under the rubble. Now, just look at these pictures, Jamie. The IDF just released them a couple of hours ago. They appear to show, well, what the IDF says, a Palestinian gunman surrendering. Many have their hands in the air. This is at the Kamal Adwan Hospital in the northern part of the Strip. But this is that same hospital that was raided by Israeli forces over the last few days. Now, some of these people are seen putting weapons on the ground, and this is an area that Israel considers a Hamas stronghold. And look, we do have some news just in, and Palestinian residents are posting pictures on social media down in the Strip saying that they've just been airdropped leaflets for bounties on the heads of Hamas leaders in the Strip. We are talking specifically here, Yahya Sinwar. Israel is reportedly offering $400,000 for anyone who gives any information to his whereabouts, so Israel can potentially hunt him down, given that he is the most wanted man here in Israel and the one that Israel holds responsible for those October 7 attacks.
Sarah, thank you for that. Our correspondent Sarah Coates in Tel Aviv. Well, Palestinian authorities say the death toll from the conflict in Gaza has now passed 18,600 people. Let's talk to our correspondent, Noor Harazin. Noor, what's the latest on the ground?
Well, talking about the latest, actually a storm hit the coastal enclave over the past days. Heavy rain. Palestinians thought that maybe this bad weather would minimize the Israeli attacks, the Israeli bombings on Gaza. However, no. What is happening on the ground is that Israel intensified its strikes on different areas along the coastal enclave. Also, intensive battles between the fighters on the ground and Israeli forces in different areas like Jabalia refugee camp, Ash-Shuja'iyya, and also in Khan Yunis. Dozens were killed in northern Gaza, dozens were killed in Khan Yunis city, dozens were killed in Rafah city in southern Gaza, and this happened over the past 12 hours, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. And actually, this is a statement that they published just less than an hour ago. They said that the death toll here in Gaza has reached 18,787 people that were killed. 70% of them are children and women. They also reported that more than 50,000 people were injured. Talking about the latest here in Middle Gaza, this is actually a leaflet that was thrown by the Israeli drones on Al-Nusayrat refugee camp, Deir al-Balah, also in Khan Yunis. They actually, the IDF put the photos of some of Hamas leaders. We have Yahya Sinwar. They actually priced him at 400,000. We have Muhammad Sinwar, Rafi' Salama, and also we have Muhammad Al-Daif at $100,000. They left an email, they left a phone number asking the people of Gaza to contact them if they have any information about the locations of these leaders. And since these leaflets were thrown on Gaza, and the people are questioning the fact if Israel actually can locate or know where Hamas fighters are, they are having these thoughts that maybe eventually Israel will invade all of the Gaza Strip looking for the Hamas fighters, putting the lives of 2.3 million people in danger under the justification of looking and attacking Hamas. All of this is happening while the Gaza Strip is going through its worst humanitarian crisis. I mean, there have been statements from the World Health Organization, the UN, the MSF, the Health Ministry here in Gaza about the deteriorating situation. I mean, now we're talking about the spread of diseases, bacteria, diarrhea, especially among kids inside shelters in UN schools or inside shelters in hospitals. The environment here in Gaza is not healthy anymore. If people do not die from the Israeli attacks and the Israeli bombings, they would die of hunger, they would die of thirst, and they could die of the diseases, especially that there is no medicine and medical supplies available anymore here in Gaza. The very simple painkillers are not even available.
Noor, thank you for that. Our correspondent Noor Harazin in Gaza. The US House of Representatives has voted to formally authorize an impeachment inquiry into President Joe Biden. The Republican-controlled chamber voted along party lines to approve the investigation, which examines whether the president improperly benefited from his son Hunter Biden's foreign business dealings. The White House has dismissed the inquiry as politically motivated. The vote ensures the investigation extends into 2024, when Biden will be running for re-election. The US judge has paused the federal case accusing Donald Trump of trying to illegally overturn the results of the 2020 election, while the former president mounts an appeal claiming he's immune from these charges. Trump has pleaded not guilty to 4 felony counts of attempting to defraud the country and obstruct Congress through schemes to repeal his loss to Joe Biden. An Australian woman who spent 2 decades in jail, wrongly convicted of killing her 4 children, has had her convictions overturned after new genetic evidence emerged. Kathleen Folbig was jailed in 2003 for the deaths of her 4 babies, despite no physical evidence being presented. She had already been released from prison and pardoned before this new evidence was found. The future of access to abortion in large parts of the United States could be decided this week. The Supreme Courts of Arizona, Texas, New Mexico and Wyoming are all looking at cases that could determine how much access, if any, a woman will have to the procedure. Our correspondent Tony Waterman reports.
No. Kate Cox has become the face of the abortion fight in America. The married mom of 2 denied an emergency abortion by the Texas Supreme Court this week, despite her doctor saying her fetus had little chance of survival and carrying it to term posed risks to her health and future fertility. Cox's lawyers say she fled the state to end her pregnancy.
Getting on the plane in the middle of a medical emergency, let alone an obstetrical emergency, is a human rights violation in and of itself.
The court, comprised of 9 conservative justices, says doctors must use their reasonable medical judgment to decide if a woman's life or health are at risk, the only exceptions to the Texas abortion ban. If doctors are found to have broken the law, they face up to life in prison. In a separate case, the Texas Supreme Court is weighing whether the state's emergency abortion exemption needs a revision to clarify who qualifies. It's just one of dozens of lawsuits filed across the U.S. challenging abortion restrictions since Roe was overturned. The Supreme Courts of New Mexico, Arizona, and Wyoming are all hearing pivotal cases this week. Justices in New Mexico are weighing whether to strike down local abortion restrictions by conservative cities and counties that run counter to the state's liberal laws, which allow for abortions up until birth. Arizona's top court is being asked to decide between two dueling abortion laws, a recent one allowing for abortions up to 15 weeks and an 1864 near total ban on the procedure. While in Wyoming, justices are weighing whether anti-abortionists should be allowed to intervene in a case that could decide if abortion is protected under the state's constitution, which says people have a right to make their own health care decisions.
I thought it was correct that those decisions were returned to the state. It never seemed logical to me that the Supreme Court would be the place where that would be generated. The states make the decision, and you know what? If people in the state don't like the decisions, they can then correct that problem at the state level.
But the U.S. Supreme Court isn't entirely out of the picture. On Wednesday, it said it would take up a case that could sharply curtail the availability of the commonly used abortion pill mifepristone, even in states where the procedure is protected. Reproductive rights, now the latest front line in America's raging culture wars. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Austin, Texas.
Farming contributes nearly 15% of all greenhouse gases, with methane one of the most harmful emissions. In Switzerland, one initiative is encouraging farmers to stop rearing animals and cultivate arable crops instead. Our correspondent Johannes Pleschberger reports.
The chicken laid their eggs in here and lived here.
About a year ago, Thomas and Fabienne got rid of almost all of their chickens and cows.
Now we're using it, for example, to dry our walnuts.
Transforming their farm from livestock to plants was a financial risk, but the Swiss couple wanted to put an end to polluting manure and poor animal living conditions.
Bei uns war der Wunsch immer sehr stark.
We always had a very strong desire to stop having chickens because we saw the animals suffering.
Weil wir einfach das Tierleid gesehen haben.
Growing lupins, wheat and soy now accounts for the majority of their income, in exchange for donations the two also care for old, unproductive livestock that otherwise would have been slaughtered. The number of Swiss farms switching from livestock to plant-based agriculture has doubled in the past 2 years. In total, about 150 farmers joined Sarah Heiligstadt's Transfarmation initiative.
Imagining that we feed 60 billion animals, but we are not able to feed all the humans on Earth, gets you thinking about how many emissions there must be, how much poverty there is induced by animal agriculture, and just imagining all these individuals, livestock individuals, that need to be fed nowadays to feed humans. If you cut that back, how many more people can you feed? Just think about it.
The impact of a few hundred transformed farms on the country's food production is small. However, it symbolizes a change going on not just in Switzerland, but all over the world. Johannes Pleschberger, CGTN, Bern.
And that is The World Today. Thank you for watching. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.